If we look at the titles to this psalm, the first one is to the chief musician. As we said before in some of the other psalms, that's like the precentor at the cathedral. In the Psalter, there are actually 55 psalms that have this title, and it indicates some sort of usage in a temple setting, perhaps an indication of a temple compilation of psalms. So there's almost certainly going to be another example of the way that the psalms are broken up into little collections, and this is one of them. The next title, Al-Tashith, is used of 4 psalms, Psalm 57, 58, 59, and 75. And in addition to showing that, again, there's a little collection of psalms, it's also a tune indication, so they say. If you look at Isaiah 65, verse 8, the phrase is identified as a popular saying. It's used of David's instructions about Saul in 1 Samuel 26, verse 9, where David says, destroy him not, or here, do not destroy. It's also used in the prayer of Moses in Deuteronomy 9:26, destroy not thy people. There is an echo of that ultimate trust in God during difficult and even deadly times. Again, it talks about this being a miktam, and there are 6 psalms that are miktams. Psalm 16, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 60. These psalms are linked to feelings of insecurity rather than sin, although you have to say that this particular psalm is heavy on sin, amongst other things. It may be taken from the word meaning covering, and the idea is that this would be a silent prayer, that the covering is to do with the covering of the lips. And that's one of the suggestions, that rather than this being a big expressive psalm, it's a quiet psalm. Again, I wonder about that. But anyway, it also might simply be a musical direction that we've lost. We've no idea what the meaning is. And I suspect that's where I'm going to land this morning. I've no idea what a miktam is, except that it's seen in 6 of the psalms. If we think about this psalm, it's got several issues. You only have to read verses 6 to 9 to realize that. Some of the issues are hidden, and they're hidden in the Hebrew. And this is a very difficult psalm. In fact, they say of verse 9, it's so difficult that every person who translates it has a different translation. So your Bible has one particular translation, but verse 9, there are thousands of translations because it's a very, very difficult verse. But some of the problems within this psalm are pretty obvious. And again, if we look at verses 6 to 9, they're pretty fiery, is an understatement. In fact, they are so fiery that when the Anglicans introduced the Alternative Service Book in 1980, they put about this psalm, they left it out and said it's not suitable for public worship. About that. So we've got it in our current prayer book. So we must have changed our minds somewhere along the line. Perhaps the world's got more cruel. As we shall see, many of these issues look at serious questions, things that we all struggle with. The structure of the psalm is fourfold. There are 4 different areas of the psalm. The first are verses 1 and 2, and we've called them the challenge. The second, verses 3 to 5, are the charge. So the challenge to the ungodly, the charge against them. Verses 6 to 9, the curse of the ungodly. And then verses 10 and 11, we could call the purge of the ungodly, the way that they're going to be dealt with. So the first of those is the challenge, verses 1 to 2. Some see a political naivety in verse 1, where it speaks about rights and wrongs, but it raises some really serious questions and a very real challenge to the ungodly. The rulers come from the Hebrew consonants LM, and you may remember those are the 2 consonants that with the vowels, Hebrew's got a strange way of being put together. In the Old Testament, you see the consonants, and you have to put in your own vowels. This is why it's difficult often to translate. The consonants are LM, and if you add the vowels, you can get from those 2 vowels Elohim, which is the word for God. You can also get Elim and a number of other things, which means something like rams. And that's been the issue with this psalm. There are too many of these words which may mean one thing and may mean another. Exodus 15 verse 15 and Ezekiel 17:13 give some suggestion that Elam may mean rams or rulers. And the idea of rams is seen very often when speaking about the leaders of the people. But Elohim is used in Psalm 82, similar consonants, and it's translated to mean angels who are human rulers over human areas. And in Job 41 verse 25 and Ezekiel 22:21, it's used not to mean gods, but mighty ones, mighty men, mighty people. So this particular verse is speaking about those who make judgments, those who are rulers. It probably is speaking about magistrates or kings. And in all sorts of ways, it's making the point that they have to make right judgments, but so often they make wrong judgments. Verse 2, you can see in verse 2, probably in your translation, it speaks about hearts early on in the verse, and then hands later on. Hearts and hands. This is trying to convey a sense of the ruthlessness in thought and in deed, a business-like efficiency of evil. And we've seen that many times in the history of the world. Micah chapter 2 verse 1 describes the unsleeping eagerness for domination of the ungodly. And here it is a cold and deliberate action that horrifies. Now I want to take you to the Holocaust and to Hitler. It's that sort of evil that is being spoken about. No concept of the difference between right and wrong, and a calculated systemic destruction of people and outworking of their evil. It's an administrative thing, and again, the idea of magistrates or rulers, governments, that is calculated. It's mischief and wickedness in the hearts of those who weigh out wickedness instead of justice. And so the scales of justice, I'm thinking of the Old Bailey here, and the Hebrew has this idea of the scales. The scales of justice are turned into a legitimate means of doing wrong. This is the challenge, both from God and from man, that human society gives to unjust judges and rulers. It's asking them the question, why are you acting in this way? Why are you so ruthless? The charge, verses 3 to 5, is the addressing of the tyrants in verse 1 and 2 has been specific, but now they are portrayed. We see them as they are. David saw there was little difference between him and the unjust rulers. It was not a question of, is he a different kind of person? He was the same kind of person. It's a question of degree. And that's an interesting thought, that we often distance ourselves from sinners. We're not like them. In fact, all of humanity does this. I'm not a sinner. I'm not so bad. And yet, David's saying, we're all the same. And as you look at this psalm, it becomes very clear that that's how he sees himself. If you were to look at Psalm 51, verse 5, that psalm about Bathsheba and his own sin, you can see this sense, I am a sinner. I have done wrong. And that's the starting point for salvation. And perhaps that's the point at which the difference between the just and the unjust is seen. The just admit that they're sinners. The unjust just assume that their way is the only way. And David says he was a sinner from the womb. And we see the description in verses 3 to 5. It's very close to Romans 3, chapter 3, verses 10 and following. And it makes us realize that we too are reflected in this sense of being sinners. If we've been granted repentance unto life, which you can find in Acts 11, verse 18, it's only because of what God has done. It's God and God alone who stops sinners being sinners. There is no other thought. And we do, as Christians, we discover that through Jesus. It's only in Jesus that we find forgiveness. The sinners follow the principle of self-interest and self-centeredness to its very bitter end. It results in lies and venom towards people. We see that in verse 4 and 5. And a turning of a deaf ear. And there's an interesting little phrase that speaks about the cobra stopping its ears. And isn't that strange? That people who don't like us telling them that what they're doing is wrong, sinners like you and me, we don't like people telling us, so we cover our ears, we stop our ears. And there's a real sense in which verse 3 shows that all of us were born into wickedness. The word for from the womb is literally from the belly. And it gives a suggestion of Genesis chapter 3, where, if you remember, God's judgment on the serpent was to crawl on its belly. Why? Because of its involvement in the sin of humanity. And there's a sense in which David captures this. It's captured in this verse, the origin of evil and sin. Verses 4 and 5, they have a venom like the poison of a serpent. This word is used in Genesis 3, that's the word serpent. And it perhaps indicates the roots of the poison of sin, the ancient serpent and liar. And in fact, later on in this psalm, we're told about liars who orchestrated man's sin and estrangement from God. And there's a determined wickedness followed by destruction. Its poison brings sin and death. A serpent, untamed, and that's what verse 5 is suggesting. But even untamable, if you were to read Jeremiah 8, verse 17. This refers to, I believe, the devil, who will not be charmed, who will not be put in his place. And you know, for you and I, in our daily lives, it's interesting, the devil constantly is tempting and tormenting us, leading us down the wrong pathway. Verse 5, however skillful the charmer may be, literally in the Hebrew, it says, one tying knots wisely. What's that got to do with serpents? I have no idea. It's been retranslated by so many, and the Hebrew was just, they say, well, the Hebrew is muddled. However skillful the enchanter may be, is a representation of one tying knots wisely. I give up on Hebrew sometimes. It really is a very strange language. It is by God's doing that the saved will be saved. But by their own doing, the lost will be lost. It's an interesting thought. That was one of the ancient commentators who said, God saves you, but you lose yourself. You get lost and estranged from God all by yourself. Those who refuse to change, the terminally willful, with the mindset that is resolutely set against God, are those who are lost. They choose the way that they live. So, the third part, the curse, verses 6 to 9. This prayer is motivated by a sense of outrage, and it is a prayer, verses 6 to 9. Outrage that brutal man should roam and ravage God's world. Why should the evil be allowed in a world like this? Why should they be allowed to destroy it? And the question of suffering is often that question. When we suffer, it's this sort of question that we begin to ask. It's rhetoric in the way that it's written. And the reason the Church of England had difficulty with it is because they took it literally as being what was being suggested. You can make your own mind upon this, but the reality is that many of the commentators see this not as real violence, but as an expression of what they'd like to do. If only I could get my hands on them, I'd wring their necks. You've probably said that, you know? Of course you wouldn't wring their necks, but that's how you feel. It's an expression of the feeling. And what was done to the sufferers was both inexcusable and massive. So if this is the response, it's not their fault that they feel like this. It is the fault of those who have perpetrated this injustice and this sense of violence and brutality. They're the ones to blame, not the victims. And this is very 21st century, because in our own society, we see all sorts of people, victims, being brutalized. So they become a double victim. You know, they've been given injustice, they've been abused or whatever, and then it all comes out in public and they're abused again. It seems to me very clear that, you know, in this particular setting, the psalmist says it's not our fault. This is the way we feel. We are violently angry, but it's not our fault. The language is immoderate, there's no doubt about it. But the reality of the situation they find themselves in is desperate. If you were to look at Psalm 109, verse 12, or 137, verse 8, you can see these responses. Dash their babies on the rocks is one of them in 137, verse 8. It is immoderate. Nobody can justify this language. And yet it reflects the violence of the emotion that they feel inside at the massive injustice that's been perpetrated on them. As New Testament Christians, our response must be to overcome evil with good. That's what we're called to do. That's what we're asked to do as Christians. Overcome evil with good. But if you read Matthew 23, there's a reminder of God's perspective on rulers and judges, especially those who are connected to the religious community, and their grim and tainted judgments. Take a look at it sometime, because you'll then understand that God himself does not like the injustices and the brutality of the world. Verse 6 takes us from obstinacy to violence with the introduction of the young lion. So we've had the serpent, the obstinate, will not be charmed, but now we've got the lions with the incisors, the teeth, and they're actually called gnashers in the Hebrew. That's where you get the idea of, I've lost my gnashers from, And this idea that it is now not about being obstinate, it's actually about the violence that these unjust people do. Verses 7 and 8 are very difficult verses, but they have 4 images which show the imminent ruin of the wicked. The first is the image of water spilt on a sandy soil that sinks into the soil and melts away. And there's an example of this not only in this psalm, but in 2 Samuel 14, verse 14. The second is all about bows and arrows. Now, this is a difficult verse because some of the commentators say, well, we should take this image from part of the image that's previous. And others say, well, actually, we'll leave it as it seems to be. So this idea of arrows, some can see that they are utterly gone as when one shoots his arrows. So they've taken the previous thing and said, the arrows are gone. Others have said, the arrows are cut to pieces, and they've taken the second part of what is being said. The third image is the image of the slug, or the snail, the shellless snail. This is to be found in the Holy Land. There's apparently a little snail that doesn't have much of a shell, and you can find all over various places remains of the shell with the dried up remains of the snail inside. So there's also a belief that as the snail went along, its track was a sign of it disappearing, wearing away as it moved. And again, there's some argument about this because the root of the word for slug or snail is a word to describe any liquid or moist substance. And some people say, let's see this as watercourse or wax. Again, you pay your money, you take choice. The fourth of the images is really quite a difficult one because it's the abortion of a woman that's being spoken about. This is not a stillborn child, and probably in your reference, it's a reference to a stillborn child, but that isn't what the Hebrew says. It's a specific word that speaks to the early part of pregnancy. Even as the child is being formed, the child is aborted. And we don't like that image now. And the idea that we would wish that on anybody is not an idea that's very reasonable to us. So those are the 4 images. And the next verse, verse 9, is a verse that has so many different interpretations, I'm almost tempted to pass it by and go on to the next verse. It defies translation. Literally, it says, before shall understand your pots a bramble, unsure what the next word is, living as, unsure, heat sweeps them off. It's no wonder nobody has got a clue what they're on about. But there are all sorts of ideas. As before the brambles make the pots ready, they are consumed. So God will whirl them, the wicked, away alive, as the fierce heat consumes the thorns. That was one person's suggestion. Here's another one. Ere they perceive it, he pulleth them up like thorns, like weeds in his wrath, He sweeps them away. Well, there you go. This is a thoroughly tangled text. In fact, I call it mangled, not tangled, in which no two versions reach the same conclusions. But anyway, it's all about what God would like to do to the wicked. We then get on to the final part, which is the purge. These verses 10 and 11, illustrate the fierceness of men who care about justice. They're called the righteous, and the idea of vengeance from God reminds us that the righteous are warriors and not camp followers. These are people involved in the battle, the righteous. And it's no wonder that they care about what's going on. Isaiah 63, verses 1 to 6, sees God appalled that no one will march with him to ensure that judgment comes about. And Revelation, if you look at Revelation, it also talks about this day of reckoning for the wicked. The wicked need to be dealt with. They often need to be dealt with violently. They need to be dealt with and disarmed. And Revelation 14, verses 9 following, and 19, verses 11 following, show that wading deep in blood, as many of us may do, is a picture conjured up by what we need to do to the wicked. They need to be dealt with and dealt with properly. We don't like this language at all in our time. Finally, verse 11, there is fruit for the righteous. And that's what the Hebrew says. It's fruit, not a reward, but fruit for the righteous. The reward is for those of faith. But those who are speaking this in the Hebrew speak about God. So they're not the faithful. They're people of good heart, the heathens, who want to see justice upheld and want to see the wicked dealt with properly. I think I've said before, when I was in the prison service, when people talked about the wicked and horrible and evil things that they did, I always said to them, one day you will stand before God and you will receive judgment for what you've done, and you will receive a punishment. This is no punishment. You have taken away the lives of people. You have raped young children. You have done some awful and horrible things. I remember speaking to somebody who'd put a bomb on a bus and killed 11 children, you know, and no amount of human justice will deal with this. God will deal with the wicked. And that's really the whole point of this psalm. It's saying we don't like injustice. We hate the violence and the mechanical violence that is being done all around us. Lord, we cry out to you, deal with these horrible people, and should be our distaste of injustice. We should feel violent about it inside. I'm not saying that we should use the immoderate language in this psalm, but it should make us feel inside that kind of, if I get hold of you, I'll wring your neck idea, which you don't mean at all, but that's how you feel. And this psalm reminds us, God deals with those who act wickedly. I hope it's been helpful to you. Thank you.